The panel just now had the title Poetry, Deep Reading, Snackability. And we had both poetry and deep reading, and it was also very snackable and very specific. And it shared a lot of topics with other panels that dealt with theater and literature and visual arts. And they saw a loss of distance and common ground, and also the politicization and use of artistic forms that are more and more boiled down to their discursive use, which is why I would now like to announce a panel dealing with historical ways of writing, so that is looking back to history, and we'll look at which models of writing about art must not be forgotten. The panel was instigated by Professor for Art History at the University of Leuphana University, where she's leading the Graduate College for Literature Critique. Beate Söntgen, that is. She worked also with Angela Lammert and the department at the university, the Humboldt University, and they worked on the archive that you can see outside the archive of different critiques of the Akademie der Künste. And Beate Söntgen, together with Ms. Voss, who was a host yesterday, also published a reader which is trying to do something similar to this panel, which is trying to gather different ways of writing about the arts from different generations and centuries or decades. And I'm very much looking forward to this panel. Hello. I would like to welcome you to this panel, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today. And the four of us would like to read our statement from the lectern, so just you're not surprised. Unfortunately, we also have to announce a loss, which was also a bit of a win. Isabel Graf, unfortunately, wasn't able to join us today. But I'm happy that we were able to get Isabel Mehl, and thank you very much for joining us so spontaneously. Before I'll introduce the participants for our panel, or at our panel, I would like to give some introductory remarks to give you some background information on this topic. Very often it seems to be clear what people mean when they talk about critique, but even on this Congress alone, there has been a lot of rejection with regard to definition of critique marked by the Enlightenment, so a form of critique that is based on rational argumentation and generalization in order to end up at just a partial part. So it is also sometimes used as a hegemonial practice, especially from the side of feminism and decolonization. There are different kinds of proposals with regard to how critique can be understood differently, but how it can also be articulated differently through different types of presenting and writing. This understanding, critique means less judging, and it means more differentiating and trying to take into consideration different perspectives. Or it can also be a room of resonance and amplifying the artistic space through language. And in the previous panel, we've already heard a lot about that. Rosi Benadotte has also mentioned or highlighted another aspect, and that is the creative potential of the critical act. Now, that doesn't mean that you forget suffering and injustice and pain, so basically situations that led to criticism. Benadotte, however, highlights positive models of a way of living in critique. The arts have been doing that for a long time, but also critical ways of writing also have this kind of potential. Ways of writing that are very different from the traditional forms of critique. Now, my question of the ways of writing is based on debates with the Graduate College of Cultures of Critique. And I would like to thank all of the members of that college for the enlightening discussions that are the basis for this panel. This panel is the continuation of a workshop on art criticism with Julia Voss, and I led at the University of Leuphana in Lüneburg, and the results were published in a reader called Why Art Criticism. Collier already mentioned that reader. It's very green, so I'm sure that you'll be able to see it in the bookshop if you want to have a look. We have representatives of different geographic and cultural and intellectual and professional backgrounds. One, in order to present one specific tradition of art criticism, and the participants are supposed to say why it was so important at the time, why it's still interesting to read it today, and what is so special about this way of writing, because the way something is written also forms or marks critique. If I do it differently, then I imagine something differently as well. The many different ways of writing of authors was not just astounding, but it also highlighted how important the location and the situation of the writers are for their form of criticism or critique, be it colonization, wars that have ended or are still ongoing, or other kinds of situations related to, or factors related to life. All of these are factors that are often forgotten, but especially in hiding and disclosing an irony in fictionalization, the meaning of the shape of writing for critical writing becomes obvious. And this is where what the panel wants to talk about. The title is based on something Ines Geipel was saying, and I changed it a little bit, and it talks about the interaction of the participatory involvement in the subject of critique and the attention on the linguistic form on the other hand, because that makes sure, or that shows how an object occurs or emerges and is being perceived. The writers on this panel in their text show that writing comes from both the body and the mind, which is why I didn't use the word or the term author, because it does not include the bodily nature of writing. Critique and writing has grown in the panelists in their bodily experiences, and all of that also becomes obvious in their texts as a basis for their evaluation of sociocultural correlations. Isabel Mehl was a cultural correspondent for many years in New York, and just these days she was talking about the legacy of John Didion. Verena Lueken has long dealt with the history of people of color in the U.S. She is, amongst others, writes texts about new editions of works by Maya Angelou and James Baldwin. Apart from works about New York, she's also written 2 novels, one in 2015 and one in 2018. She's received several prizes, and she lives in Berlin and Frankfurt. Next to her, we have Ines Geipel, who is a writer, publicist, and lecturer, and she lives in Germany and Poland, and it is kind of divided in the middle, meaning that she is living in 2 political situations. And actually not Poland, in Poles, excuse me. She also was an athlete in the GDR, but she also studied German studies. She is dealing with the aftermaths of National Socialism in Eastern Germany, doping in athletics and the military, as well as forgotten literature from Eastern Germany, with a special focus on female authors. In 2009, she published a book on female authors in Eastern Germany. She's written many other books, for instance, Generation Wall, a portrait from 2014, a book on her brother and hatred in the East, and a study called Beautiful New Sky from the Military Laboratory of the East. She has received many awards and prizes. What I'm especially delighted about is that today we will be able to deal with topics in Eastern and Western Germany, a topic that is very apt here at the German Academy of Arts. Isabel Mehl received a PhD on a work on doubt, Madame Realism, or the Function of Fiction in Art Criticism. The book has just been published. Together with Leuphana and Laura Kowaleski, she is founding member of Where I Stand, which deals with possibilities and forms of feminist and collective ways of writing. She is currently researching at the Humboldt University in Bonn on writing practices of women apart from that emerged aside from art criticism, and she works as free author, for instance, for Deutschlandfunk Kultur and the magazine Fries. When I asked the panelists whether they wanted to participate, I asked them to characterize their own writing in a statement with regard to object genres and their style. I especially wanted to know how object and ways of writing, what kind of interrelationship they have, and where they see the potential in their text, especially with regard to their specific way of writing and their role in the critical act. I also wanted to know what current and historical authors were very important for their own writing, because the question of how critique can look like in the future isn't just based on the view on the diversity of writing practices, but also on the depths of previous forms of writing and genres. Thank you very much. Hello. Now it's my turn. I would like to talk about my way of writing, and let me go back. As Beate just mentioned, I write about literature and film, recently much more about literature, but today I would like to speak as a film critic. Because we've already said a lot about literature critique, especially in the beginning, during the keynote by Sojourn Varadaraja, he really said the most important aspects, and I couldn't add anything, and I couldn't even say it better. So I would like to talk about film critique. And the object of film criticism or film critique has changed over the last years or decades, and quite dramatically. That is why I think we can look at it more closely, and that doesn't really have anything to do with writing, but with the way things are in general. But I think that these fundamental changes of the objects have an effect on my own writing. So let me go back to the beginning, and it has always been a multitude of issues, and the critique has always reflected that. The film is an industrial product in contrast to many other forms of art, and especially in contrast to literature. And, in the public sphere, the films were usually shown in a cinema. The first two pillars are still there, but the first is kind of unstable, but film production is still possible without the industry, as you can see on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Also, it's not just been since yesterday that those who film critics don't need to go to the cinema. Most live a life outside of cinema and independent of cinema. Cinema and film and other kinds of images can be found everywhere, and not all of them are made for the cinema. And I think only few of them actually need a critic. But the cinema, in its threefoldedness, used to be a specific cultural practice that was part of film, and film was the visible expression of cinema. That's how Lars Gass once called it. He is now director of the Kunstfilmtage in Oberhausen, and he was really trying to champion for or champion the fact that we shouldn't give up cinema. I don't know if his fight or his battle is lost, but he wrote a very good book on this topic. So, that once used to be the basis, the foundation of film critic, as well as for the environment where it took place. Now, the cinema as cultural practice is kind of dwindling, but there have never been as many films as today. So the question is, what does film critique do with that fact, or how does it deal with that fact? That is so it is important and decisive to try and figure out or try to understand that the viewer is no longer the private person, which it now is on their own couch, because now a lot is being consumed at home in the couch, and previously it used to be alone in this public sphere, but together with other people, so in the cinema. Now the reception of film usually, if we're talking about cultural products and not advertisements in a shopping mall, is an individual practice. So in the current environment, what is the object of film criticism? And what is the object of film critics? Ms. Allison, an American sci-fi writer who I like a lot, and in 2018 he died, and he published his criticism on his YouTube channel, or his reviews on his YouTube channel, and he said, in view of the situation that we were facing even at the time, without critic we are doomed to die a strangulating death of mediocrity. We, so society, that is us, the viewers, that deserve the best. And in order to understand what the best possible would be, he is of the opinion, and I agree with him, for that we need criticism, we need critique. But now, as critics, how can we achieve time and time again to ask for more than mediocrity? And what does mediocrity mean? Who is setting the benchmarks? What are the criteria? And how can we avoid to go back to this auto-iterative gesture, meaning that I, as a critic, know what is good and what is not? So these three different pillars that I talked about, so industry, art, and public sphere, and thinking all of these things together when it comes to film was the main target and the criterion for a good film review. So it wasn't really to judge whether something was good or bad, but to find out in what relationship these different elements were and what it meant with regard to the decisive question, in my opinion, and that is, what was the experience between film and viewers in the sphere of the cinema? Was there at all the possibility to have an experience, or was the aesthetic principle of film being overwhelmed, indoctrination, sensitization? These are the questions that still remain, but we need to ask ourselves whether it is important that films are mutating to installations or series and migrate to museums and to the internet. I'm especially concerned about the form. It is about a process and an expression, and all of that constitutes the object which I'm trying to talk about here. I feel faced with it's about trying to translate a visual form into a linguistic form and trying to rescue something that is specific to the media. Reviewing films needs to be part of the discourse on issues that are important for society based on the analysis of artistic questions, and that hasn't changed. I think that is still its task. So, that was more or less the preamble for the characterization of my own writing. I've been observing myself for a long time now when I write, and the more I do that, the more I get a sense or a feeling that I invent my subject when I write, that when I think about a film, I generate a text which might be different from what other people see when they watch the same film. Now, how can that be true? How can that be the case? Writing about films is a translation process from one medium to the other. Now, it seems to be straightforward that the structure of the task, to use the narrative element of a film. So that's how film reviews kind of, talk about the content of films, which we called contentism in a previous panel. It is interesting when a text tries to answer to a film in its form, so it doesn't really focus on the kind of story that is being told, but what kind of questions a film is asking. Not to give answers, but to answer these questions in the process of writing. What kind of own experiences flow into this type of reflection, and how closely they keep being tied to the work, and how they can be mediated, and how they are integrated into your own critical sentences. That is the personal element of writing, or at least that's how I would characterize my own writing. Is that still critique? If it's not really a judgment, if it doesn't contain a judgment? I believe it is, at least in the sense of an essayistic writing and not really in the sense of a review. So the review of a film in the English-speaking world is defined very differently than in Germany, because in Germany there are a lot of kind of mixed forms, but the reviewing itself is a very formalized process. And for a long time, I haven't actually been doing that. Now, I would go so far as to say that where it is about a artwork well done, art kind of forms an alliance with critique, and Jimmy Robert mentioned it in the beginning when he talked about caring during a previous panel. I think that the critique, the mysterious nature of it, so I think the critique protects the mysterious nature of a work, that it is not trying to disclose it, to take it out of the artwork, but to protect it in the process of writing. So on the one hand, critique is based on trying to understand the context, which I think is the expertise without which critique doesn't make any sense. If we define critique in a way that has to do with insights, but critical writing on this basis generates a text which, in the best case scenario, is similar to the work that starts a process in the readers that goes beyond the process that the work itself creates. So on the one hand, mimetically, but also on the other hand, adding something. Now, I was also asked what my role models and influences were. One big role model of mine is still Frida Grafe, the legendary critic who worked for the Süddeutsche Zeitung. But as I learned very late, she wasn't actually employed by the Süddeutsche Zeitung, but she was an independent or freelancer, and she did really crazy things. So, for instance, sometimes the editors came. She said that she wanted to have specific photos or images that were supposed to go with her text. It's completely unimaginable today to be able to do that. And that's quite fantastic that she did that. And, Frida Grafe really wrote the subject in her critics or in her reviews, even in the very short ones. Another critic that I really admire from very different reasons, Pauline Kael, and both of them have actually passed away a while ago. And Pauline Kael wrote her reviews in such a way that she actually invented the film that she wrote about. But usually she was less nice about the films than Frida Grafe, but she was very sarcastic and also was courageous enough to sometimes have a completely wrong judgment, and I think that's a very important character trait that a critic should have. So both had their very own profile as critic that was formed by this way of writing, and Alan Hellison, I already mentioned that name, and they have all passed away, but someone who is still alive and someone who I increasingly read is Hilton Als from The New Yorker. He is writing a lot about literature, but when he writes about films, I always like it a lot because it's very insightful, because he's very clear with regard to the positions that he writes about, also his bodily position that he writes from. So for all of them, one thing is true, and that is that they all were adamant that it needs to be part of the discourse of social questions based on the decision made in artistic processes. So in the time that Frida Grafe was active and Pauline Kael, both of them, this question was the increasing violence between different social groups, the gender question, and the question of political corruption. These are all issues that are not very far from the ones that we are grappling with today. But let me mention some examples from the history of film. In the 1960s, that was the time of the Vietnam War and the protest movement. Violence came to the cinema, in a completely new format, as did the hippie movement, and from that emerged a new form of critique and a new form of films. New Hollywood, and later in the 1970s and 1980s, when the relationship between the genders was renegotiated and new formats came into the cinema that were also new formats or were related to new forms of criticism. And in both cases, for New German Cinema and New Hollywood, it was really this type of caring critique. So these were critics that felt like they were in the same boat as the film critics. And of course, now we can say, well, was there enough distance in order to actually write a useful or a critique that makes sense? But, we might also say that, maybe today we would use the word scene, maybe. There was a kind of discourse room or space that was filled with both the filmmakers and the film critics, and they both talked about this space. And today, I think the situation isn't the same anymore, and that has to do with everything that we've already mentioned. But that is not just because of film. Partially, yes. But if you wanted to go to the cinema tonight, for instance, to watch David Cronenberg's Crimes of the Future, you would be confronted aesthetically, but also with regard to content, with questions of body horror and the relationship of flesh and technology. That is something that we also deal with in other environments. So the critiques on or about this film, or Julia Ducournau last year, Titan, for instance, that was also dealing with the relationship between technology and body, that it doesn't actually start a debate in the public sphere has to do with the different locations of critique. Now, if I don't remember wrong, I think the last time that a film actually started a debate which went beyond the film-specific sphere that was really a social debate was maybe 1995, maybe, with Schindler's List. But of course, you know, on the where they really, on the basis of a film, there was a debate on whether it's possible to show images from Auschwitz and bring or just talk about the camps in a fictional relationship. Maybe I've forgotten something, maybe something else happened in the meantime. But you know, that was a point in time where we were able to see there used to be this strength and this power and going out of this very specific world of the film and the cinema.
In a broader societal context. Thank you. So, may I follow up immediately and thank you for the invitation, but also my thank you goes to Beate Söntgen, who invited me to reflect on what we are doing in the end. Normally, you don't think about what you are doing, you are just doing what you are doing. So the difficulty lies always in the fact that you slide all too easily into self-appraisal. Therefore, at the beginning, I refer to an Italian poetess, Cristina Campo, probably you know, and on to her volume, The Unforgivable Justice and Criticism have two things in common. They are different forms of mediation. Art as well as criticism are, for De Campo, forms of mediation. So, and I quote, it is the capability which is totally open for attention. Attention is essential for the works of De Campo, for a multi-layered reading of the reality that surrounds us, a stratigraphy of the surrounding world. And I quote once again, the dissolution and reshaping of the world in two different moments that are equally real. What does De Campo mean by that? For her, there is a first vertical reality that becomes, through this heightened attention, a second reality. What is created is just like a second nature that is driven to the extreme of responsibility, or a feeling that you are responsible for something. You stand up for something or for someone. I think that's a wonderful wording. In De Campo's universe, there are some concepts appearing that I find relevant when we talk about joint reflection on a possible role model of artistic intervention. For one thing, it is the possibility to read the stratigraphy of reality, the vertical and horizontal, and then also the disarticulation and the reshaping of reality, and the capacity mentioned already to stand up for something or for somebody. In this sense, the concept of responsibility is implied. What is relevant here is, beside all those concepts, especially also the genesis, during this search for the right concept, I would call it the collision sections and the sorting out of reality. De Campo decomposes not for its own sake, but in order to be able to reconstruct, well, I would say, with a view to my own writing, well, I feel unease about this term of the critical writing. I would rather term it a search, a quest, a representation, or a categorical opening. When it comes to vertical reality, well, what matters to me is the various layers of the subject matter during time and in the historical landscape. The vertical axis demands an excessive amount of research. It archives. Let me be explicit about this. I think this is not irrelevant here. Intense reading and possibly also eyewitnesses of those times. Vertical research means to look precisely at the material, decomposing it, try to interpret it in a first reading for a first draft of the text, reinterpreting it, skinning the material, slimming it down, and thinking it slim, then applying the section and recomposing the material. Attention, well, yesterday and today it played an important role. It presupposes time, valid fields of discourse, and also a reference frame due to certain amplifiers, and for other reasons, however, we see it as an implosion. Nonetheless, is it possible? What else is possible? Despite all this, being a genuine part and parcel of the textual landscape, not in the sense of I myself, but making oneself present and felt in the material. What does it mean? The self is also subject to the decomposition. It must not know. The self becomes a matter. Is it more than just self-acclaim? If you go through the shelves if you want to publish a book with a publisher, you need an exposé, a first draft, and a sample text. But how can you illustrate the decomposition and recomposition of world with decampo in two separate moments when reality is ready before you write it? What else is writing? Why on earth do we write? The second reality that decampo drafts should provide a textual space where words can find their proper places. If I take it seriously, that cannot be realistic narratives. It's not about thinking it over and over and closing it by thinking it over. You need a very low number of words, but just these words at just these places, if you recompose them, if you take away or if you add something, it's like dimming the light and nothing is right again. These words need to be able to take the readers to those very spots that are the only possible ones. We do also have a sort of timidity and shame in writing, and a sense of unnecessary things, which means I need to say something about the matter and about the things. The construction of pain is not voyeuristic. It's about the collisional sections of intimate and historic space, and also an attempt to break through the sanctity. But what is still there as layers of myths, well, in this sense, I want to write myself into this political internal space. And by necessity, I am approaching this very German wall, running the risk of not getting through this wall. Maybe I'm writing constantly about silence to end up with silence. But that's also something that I bet on. Violence leaves behind so much disorder. And I think I must be willing to let this go, that there is no conclusio, that my initial thesis will not come true. In the end, you do nothing else but design a square, which means I try to claim a place in the textual landscape that it never had. That's where I need the fiction. Fiction that tries to write itself out of the eye of the hurricane. Nonetheless, this text must reflect and must protect the experience. I think it's the swaying of a pendulum. It's a very strong amplitude between reality and fiction, which is based more than on anything else on experience. To create such a textual tissue, it's like mending very old shoes. You cannot discard the shoes. They are an image. They are also part of your identity. So I have to examine them. I have to repair them, to mend them somehow so that they can still hold together. Writing means for me, even though it has been said already, means for more than anything else, asking questions, embarking on a quest. Last point, the horizontal reality. What on earth had De Campo in mind when I talk about the trias of text writing, audience, readership? Then, well, it's about the question how the readers can be let into the text. How can they become co-workers in my text and co-searchers? At the beginning, they know as little as the textual me. But then gradually they will develop their readiness to let go of the usual reading habit. It's not bending to the knees in front of the audience. It's the acknowledgement of a horizontal reality, a coercive expressiveness with a categorical look at the readers. It's like on a theatrical stage. As if you opened up your arms. It's not a simple thing, although it looks so easy, it hurts, and it's got to hurt. Thank you very much. May I now present my type of writing and the book that has been mentioned by Beate. Let me start out in a rather audacious way, how I see my voice. I understand my writing as a tentative movement on the search where I never know where I will end up with. I would describe my voice as associative and full of leaps and surprises and dialogical, geared up towards the reader. I see the correspondence as the knowledge of all phenomena. The dialogue, the interview, a written dialogue, I try to open up my thoughts. To what degree I succeed remains to be judged by others. I want to be entertaining. Well, to be entertaining, I love being read with pleasure. I don't want my writing being seen as a sort of coercive duty. The experience of expositions, what is the behavior of the other visitors who might travel to and from the journey, but also my daily routine. With Bernali, I would argue my experience and also the writing down of my text are influenced by it. It's a process of mutual constitution. I unearth aspects in the objects of art, and I discover things, or the art makes me discover possibilities of seeing that I can experience only with that object. It's a situated writing. Thanks to its situatedness, it doesn't want to get rid of the situation. On the contrary, it wants to address this. My writing is informed rather by literary than academic practices. These are quite often texts by writing Amos Siemens, Considerations of Astrology, Jutta Köters, Mrs. Benaway from Specs. Sense of humor and also the anchoring of my considerations in one or my present plays a huge role in my present time. I see also the critical enterprise. Where is the art situated in terms of criticism? Well, to hammer it out in more concrete terms, I come to my book. That is my doctoral thesis. For years, since 2016, I dealt with the material of the neo-org author Lynn Tillman, especially in the fictitious art critic Madame Realism is at the 17 art realism stories have been published for diary entry, travel report, short story, or depiction of a dream reacts to the artistic Lynn Tillman's or mannerisms. Art is always the starting point of the stories, but not always in a direct and immediate way. Madame Realism's function in the publishing context of the art magazine consists also in the localization of the art consideration in a societal place. She also translates it into a rather plausible way. This general interest is a parallel to my enterprise and that of Tillman. Imitation of Life, this story from 1987. She attends the inauguration of Fake and Meditation on Authenticity in New Museum. On the unisex toilet, she meets up with two women. I think this is Madame Realism. But do you think fictional statements can ever be true? The story ends with her way home. Repeatedly, she is asked for money by needy persons. Finally, she hands money to the last person. Then she thinks about the homeless and how this design suggests a homogeneous group. The word homeless itself mainly categorizing and dismissing in one blow. Tillman conjures the concrete social conditions into the text. The critical potential of critical fictions of Lynn Tillman is already struck. The situation of Madame Realism in the concrete situation shifts the focus on the implications, her interests, her privileges. She can give money to another person, she can reflect it, and also her shortcomings in her perception are different from the biographical interpretation that normally hits at female writing. Madame Realism reverts this. A critical subject without any biographical anchoring. It's not Lynn Tillman as Lynn Tillman is speaking on the occasion of art, but Madame Realism is interposed. This interposition of a character makes it clear how deeply the object of the description is formed by the writing subject. Quite often we forget that art needs not be experienced as it is depicted in the history or in this. Madame Realism from 2001 shows that brilliant Madame Realism in her dreams encounters various sculptures by Jeff Koons. They start talking to her, among them the sculpture Michael Jackson Bubbles. Crying Jackson finally addresses her in her comic terms. It doesn't matter what you expect to see. It's just as taste. What is taste? Through this fictitious framing of the art experience, there is a moment of distancing. The rejection that I, as an observer, feel normally towards works of art is postponed. Madame Realism, anchoring in the imagination of the readers, opens the possibility up to them to reflect themselves in this projection. We represent them. We imagine her. How old is she? What is her background? It is more than likely that Madame Realism, in a way, is drafted as our own mirror image. Our Madame Realism tells us so much about our own situatedness, our references, our imagination, its limitations. Madame Realism's hyperrealism. Due to her obviously fictitious character, it conjures up a doubt about the reality experience that we had anyway. The ambiguity that questions the reality of just one reality refers to the central idea of Madame Realism, doubt. Tillman, by using Madame Realism, contributes to a feminist emancipatory practice. It uses the potential of imagination to highlight the positive and productive force of doubt and making it available to criticism. Madame Realism does not give any answers. On the contrary, she formulates further questions. When it comes to her specific way of questioning, she believes that she does not know everything. She wants to learn from others. Therefore, she is ready to listen. But what is the critical potential in the academic study of these stories? Well, at the beginning, many questions arose to me. For example, how can I experiment with a mode of academic writing? How can an experimental writing practice that does not keep the writing self invisible, but on the contrary exposes it, how can I give way to my spontaneous feelings in both as an art historian and as an academic? Looking for a mode of writing that reacts to the I ended up with Flektorcryptum, going to John Randolph, Canadian art critic. What on earth it is? Well, this would go beyond the time limits, but under the aspect of critical writing, questioning the objectivity ideal in academic studies, questioning the discursive power and solidarization with marginalized knowledge. For example, a feminine knowledge. Victor criticism concentrates on the two areas: things said, the representation of things said, and the difference what the thing said about a thing means for the thing. It's not about rendering more appealing any subject matter, but this can be a positive side effect. In my book, I depict, for example, my first encounter with Tillman and my realization that access to her text is a completely different one than mine own. I'm looking for answers to certain deficits in the sources in a way that you've quite often the addressees find confusing. The relationship between myself and Madame Realism must be livable. The personal encounter with Tillman have a side effect on my readers and on my writing. Another question that arose to me was that I declined and how to avoid the definitive answer to this complex of Madame Realism. I decided to set the stage for a multi-vocal choir by my selection of tests and by the anecdotal encounters with her and associative reactions, for example, from interrupted by literature that I was reading. So it was about destabilizing my own voice and to see my own voice as one possible interpretation. Although academic writing is a tentative procedure, the end product is quite often invisible. However, this quest should be exposed and finally on the authors that are important. Beate asked us about them. The London collective, the White Cube, Gabriele de la Pointe, Sarina Mohammed. I found they started their project in 2015 as a counterpoint to the official discourse. Anuti Samari. You can also listen to their reports as a podcast. Their situatedness in everyday life and their criticism of the situation determine their style of writing. More than anything else, they are fantastically good. Well written for the text. Carla Alonso's Autoritratto of 1969. Lonzi experiments with another form of criticism of art by observing the productive process and an encounter with the artist. So she ended up with a fictitious dialogue that was composed of different meetings with different artists in the 60s. I'm guessed by the gallery dies Bernard Lee, who in the years 1901 to 1904, in her notes, Lee works out the conditionality of art criticism on the daily state of mind, the body, the steps, but also tunes that we have in the air are influences on the writing of art. We become also part of those reviews.
Thank you very much to the three of you for your statements. One aspect that seemed important for all three of you, and that's also the reason why I invited you, is that on the one hand you presented the writing, the subject as something that needs to be written, and on the other hand, bringing this subject into a political, cultural, or social context. Now, who do the readers meet in such a collision between the writing and the social realm? Verena, would you like to begin? I'm kind of overwhelmed by everything that the two people who came after me said. Now I kind of need to sort my thoughts. Now, who do the readers meet? She meets a text. That seems obvious, but it's maybe not as banal as it sounds. In my case, I'm speaking about a film, but the reader is meeting something completely different. The same holds true for visual art, for instance. Now, what does that mean? It means that the other kinds of she is supposed to follow certain mediation strategies and is allowed to do so. That are part of something that is also part of the work, and if that is achieved, then a space opens in which a reader meets the text as well as the work that is being described in the text in the ideal scenario. That's how I would want it to be. Now, what is a good text? And I would answer that question by saying it's a good text if that is achieved. Ines, this meeting between the I and the representable reality was something you described by collision, or maybe I misunderstood you, but that would be a softer description. You could say that there's a meeting between the world and the reading I. Could you maybe speak more about these collision points that you mentioned? Well, for the last books that I wrote, the reviews didn't always, but sometimes mention that something is being mixed, so fiction and source. And every time I would actually answer that I don't mix these things, but I confront them with each other. So the source is being confronted with the fictional space. And that has a lot to do with the content. The last book, Beautiful Blue Sky, Schöner Neuer Himmel. So the person that the book is about, through its way through the archive and this process of finding can't be found because this person only exists as a code in the historical realm. And so I need literature. I need literature in order to find something that has disappeared or was brought or made to disappear, and I need that in order to get it out of the depths of history. And that's also what I meant when I was talking about the pendulum. So I need to look at the material very closely, and only then can I decide which or what I want to do with that material. So where I make my cuts, as I've mentioned them, and what I need, what is essential for showing what I want to say, or maybe also uncovering or covering even. Now, covering or uncovering, that brings us back to Madame Realism. Now, Isabel, who do we meet when we read Madame Realism? You meet a very unstable subject that reinvents itself in every single story. So an art critic is maybe also a confusing term for that person, because it only emerges in the exchange with the work. There's also a story where she is in an exhibition catalog. She's trying to figure out what kind of function she is supposed to fulfill. Can she be a source or not? So the question is, what kind of subject position can we speak from, and what does it do with the process of reading if I have a subject that keeps pulling itself out of it? And I think that the question of the subject position is very central, and that's what we meet in these stories. Now, my next question is maybe first for you, Isabel, because you mentioned it very explicitly in your talk. What role plays the genre? You three are in very different genres when you write, but what kind of role does the genre play when it comes to choosing the way you write? Well, the genre of Lynn Tillman's fiction is what I call critical fiction, because she has a very critical goal in these fictions, and so I use it as a kind of collective term for her writings. I don't think that genre is very helpful, so I personally don't find it helpful to choose one or try and allocate it to one, because it can also be very unhelpful, because sometimes you think, okay, that's what it is, but I think it's important that you need to look at every single case and try and figure out what happens in that case. Is a traditional art critic, for instance, when she thinks about Renoir, and another text has more a tendency towards critical fiction. And so, I think that what I would prefer to keep it open, even if that's the trend that the genre tends towards, I would think. I think Jutta Müller-Tam mentioned it during the previous panel. She mentioned that the genre has gained a new importance, and I thought that was very interesting, because the way I understood it was that over the last 10 to 20 years, the crossing genres and not sticking to the limits of genre have been very decisive. Now, Ines, you write for newspapers, you write your own books that are somewhere between autofiction, such as My Brother, The Hatred and the East, which connects your personal experience with experience of history. Now, how would you call your own writing with regard to genre? Now, I can only say that I have a very blind spot in this regard. I only exist once, and this is the material and the topics that I work with, and it's a text. That's a fantastic answer. Verena, you also wrote novels, apart from your work as a publicist. Now, how do these two different ways of writing, how do they approach each other? Are they very separate ways of writing? Or are there also similarities? They have very different forms of writing. And for me, that is due to the fact that the fictional or the auto-fictional writing, for me, and I only started very late doing that is a kind of, freeing yourself from trying to make reference to a subject. And that's, what we have in journalism and publicism. You always write about a subject and you have a certain responsibility, in my understanding. And I would like to mention a term, and that is truthfulness. And I think that term is extremely important. And as a journalist, that is an extremely important term, because you try and be responsible or assume responsibility with regard to the truth. Also, when it comes, it's of course difficult when you talk about art, but it's still not something fictional, right? But the fictional writer can say, well, I can do whatever I want. So they don't really have a subject with regard to whom I need to behave responsibly. So as the title says of this panel, I move in a linguistic realm, and that's what I'm interested in. And I'm not interested in what comes out of what is out or beyond this realm or this room or this space. Of course, then there's the whole operation outside of that. But, I think the most important difference is that in journalistic writing, there's a subject that I'm dealing with. Now, I would be interested in the following question. How does the subject of the writing correspond to the I? So how does the writing change the perception of the writer? Ines, would you like to go first? I was thinking about what Verena just said, but how about historical subjects? Because you say, well, that there is absolute freedom. I only meant it for my own writing, because that's how I understood your question. So how my way of writing changes between journalism and fictional writing. So that was only for my writing, right? Of course, what happens in your books or in other books, that brings us back to genre, that aren't so limited to their certain genre. And of course, especially that happens when it's about history and real existing persons, then yes, there is this kind of responsibility as well. But the question that you asked was about the I that emerges. Oh, but I think that aspect is very interesting. Maybe we'll answer the other question later and look a little bit more closely at the role of fictionalization, because once I start telling a story, once I start telling something, it's something fictional. It's not banal. Language doesn't mirror something, it describes something, and that means that it kind of moves the subject. Now, especially with regard to your writing, Ines, because out of the four of us, you're the one who is mostly dealing with historic material. Now, what is your role in the reconstitution of the subject? You choose certain scenes, you put it in a certain frame, you might also show it in a different light. So what kind of role does the fictional have in your description of historical phenomena or situations? Well, indeed, that really depends on the subject. For Schöner neuer Himmel, one of my novels, for instance, there was hardly any research on that subject. So the book is not really just an attempt to create an order for a history of sciences or for a historical space. But it was a very, very much a tightrope walk, because I'm not really I don't want to be a scientist for cosmology, or I'm not a pharmacist or a doctor or a biologist, but I was an author or maybe professor of verses, and that's how I came to military research. So just that needed 5 years of research until I actually dared to speak about that. And that has a lot to do with the history of the East. And I just felt like it was time for this very large room, for this large space. And of course, it also means that you, in a way, open a door and trying to hope that the door that you opened is then being used by a lot of others, because, the kind of possibility of the kind of research you could do on that is impossible. It is unlimited, because a lot of questions I didn't even mention that, of course, I was trying to grapple with. At the same time, I also, I would like to use another term that plays a role in your writing as well, is you wish for a kind of conditionless space or room, but it's impossible, which is why I use the term experience before. A conditionless gaze or view, that is impossible. People who say they do that's kind of preposterous. People who say I'm approaching this subject without any kind of previous preconceived ideas, I don't think that's ever possible. But when, there is a certain degree of experience, we need to have a different kind of caution, because you then also might have a certain negative stance with regard to a subject, and all of that then also has an effect on the text. And I'm trying to write all of that into the text as well, saying I'm that and that exists, which is why there could be an operation with the historical blind spot. So, this categorical courage that you enter into when you enter the realm of a text, that exists. And that's the risk of writing as well. And it can also go completely pear-shaped. Now, and the term risk might bring us back to the question that I asked earlier, and that is how your presence in the realm of language affects your eye, and how it then changes the writing that comes after, and what this relationship between writing a subject and rewriting yourself can also occur in the text. Verena, would you like to say something to that question? Well, my answer might be a little bit risky, but of course, dealing with aesthetic subjects changes a person. Of course it does. And if that person expresses him or herself in a text, then this person is also changed when dealing with these aesthetic phenomena. Now, how this kind of looks like in detail in individual cases, I wouldn't really be able to say, but I think that experience is extremely important here, the term of experience. So these days, so not today, but these days, I don't know, I've been watching films for 40 years. Now, when I go to a film festival these days and I meet these films as the person I am today, then I have to say I've seen all of it. I have seen all of it in a different form. Now, if I sit next to a critic who has only watched films for 20 years, she might say, ah, it kind of seems familiar, but there's also that and that and that. And you can't make up for this experience by saying, okay, I'm watching all of these things on YouTube. And it's the same for someone who starts today, and sometimes they're very astounded by certain phenomena. And then as an older critic, you have to kind of shut up and listen to the personal views that can be constituted today by a completely different generation and their experience with regard to a product that seems very outdated to me with the experience that I have. But you know, that a generation with a very different socialization also when it comes to media and the way they look at the same product with a lot of astonishment and a lot of excitement. And of course, that also expresses itself in our writing. And so that's why I say I don't write about it, because I think, you know, in most cases, you know, the development of my own view of films has kind of been completed, unless something entirely new will happen in the world of film. It doesn't currently look like it will, but then I read with a lot of interest what someone is telling me, with someone who is coming from a very different background with regard to his or her generation and also geographical background. I think that young critics today have a very similar volume as I do, you know, because at the time when I didn't watch any films, you know, they now have the same kind of volume because they started earlier. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that the eye, of course, changes in an experience that it makes with the subjects that it writes about. I mean, of course, that would entail a text exegesis, but I don't know if that's possible. But did I understand you correctly? So you're saying that so kind of critique doesn't no longer deal with subject. Is that what you said? No, I just said that I'm turning towards other subjects, or have done that. That's what I said. Not no, dear God, no. Because I've understood you correctly, then you said I don't see a lot of new things happening in film. In the films that I watch, I don't see a lot of new things, but I'm only speaking for myself, and I don't write it anyway. I don't write, there's nothing new to see. That's not, I didn't say that, and I won't say it, but I'm just saying a lot of things are being repeated, and in theater as well. Which is why I'm rather interested in others, in the view of others, than my own view. That would have been, yeah, that would have been quite interesting, you know, if you had said that the subjects have kind of disappeared, but that the critic is still there. No, it's the other way around, actually. The critic disappears and the subjects are still there. That's fantastic material for a novel. Okay, that brings me to my last question, which I would like to ask to all three of you. And, you know, you can talk about your own writing experience, but also with regard to the writing of others. Maybe you can talk about the future of critique, especially with regard to the ways of writing and the design or the shape of writing. Do you see changes? Do you see a potential that has now only started to unfold? Isabel, would you like to begin? I believe that the question that was also asked by Isabel Graf in the text critique of art critique with regard to methods, and you know, where you realize more and more as an art critic how many different kinds of ways of discrimination you are entangled in, and value creation also, and how you can deal with that methodically, but not in a simple way. And trying to look for these methods or methodologies is something that I think we will have to deal with for a long time. And I think it's also good because it's a time where you can really experiment a lot. I think that art critic has been in a crisis for such a long time, and it's a good sign, I think, because it also stands for change, and the fact that it has only come into crisis at such a late point is only due to the fact that for a long time we didn't realize how discriminating it was. So I think it's a very interesting process that has begun. Now, what kinds of ways of writing are fit for the future? I think that ways of writing that destabilize the writing subject, that find possibilities, that make sure that I don't have to set the I, but that I can question positions with regard to what position do I write from, but that you also allow for ambivalences. And that's maybe what I wanted to say when I talked about Kuhns. It's also about not just making judgments right away, but opening spaces in which you can deal with something. I think art criticism or art critique needs to open spaces, open language spaces in which you can deal or approach something and without having the answer before you enter that space. Verena, would that be the critique that will come? Destabilization of the speaker? Yes, that's a very important aspect. Now, well, not just for this panel, but also previous panels, I heard and I had to think of a quote, which I don't really know where it comes from, but I think it was Laurie Anderson who said it. But it could have also been Susan Sontag. I don't really know. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. But because it just occurred to me, I couldn't really verify. And the quote is more or less the follows. It was for sure a woman, and she said, writing on film is like dancing on architecture. And that's what I would hope for, dancing on architecture. For me, that would be the ideal new way of writing. Ines, what would be your suggestion? I was really listening to you very closely, and a lot of things felt very close to me with regard to the procedural now. But with regard to critique, I think I would love to read something where someone is writing about the kind of overview that we've lost, and if someone really pinpoints that. Because I realize that I am a bit ambivalent. A lot of processes, I think, are fantastic. And there's also, and also the polyphony, I think, is also fantastic. But at the same time, I also realize I also want to know what our criteria are, what are we aligning ourselves with, and what is the political space in which we formulate into as authors, and will we be able to create this kind of discourse? When you talked about films, you said the last film that was relevant for society, you probably formulated it differently. You said maybe that kind of stirred up society or led to a huge debate was Schindler's List. I thought maybe The Life of Others, but maybe that's just my perspective coming from Eastern Germany. That's, of course, possible. But it's a kind of, in me, I don't know, I kind of go back and forth between the pixeling of critique, so this really the fragmentation of voices and a desire for a type of critique that is relevant for society. Now, of course, then we have to ask the question, what is actually relevant for society, but I have the feeling that the critical space is a bit overcrowded.
Well, I didn't mean it that way. Well, one thing matters to me. It was just a historical description of the way in which we have reached this level where we are now. Not I feel longing for those feelings. I wouldn't even be able to tell you in what space criticism could take up this role when it comes to film criticism. Well, it would have to be a suitable film. Then there should be and would be places of criticism that have such a radiation that practically everybody would feel attracted to this media. I just wanted to say it would be great if a thing like that happened again. So several proposals are lingering in the room here to all the writing people. The destabilization of the subject, the concrete hammering out of the subject, and the concrete dancing on architecture. Thank you very much. Do we have time to take questions from the audience? 3 minutes left, so anybody wants to ask a question? Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. I must say, being a film critic myself, having been active in this industry for 20 years, whether a film critic has a best before date printed on her back, well, I think this is possible. My question goes to Verena. What's your experience? We, as film critics, well, to function even in future in this wonderful trade, can we learn how to forget what we have seen? I don't want to forget everything. Well, I do want to forget certain things, and actually I do forget them. But I need an escape route. The escape route have always been the documentaries, and it is obvious why that is the case. This is also the huge fascination that the documentaries are getting better and better in documentary. Well, new forms are being developed and genres are blasted open, while in the feature film certain formulas have stayed the same for the last 2 decades. Thank you. Is there yet another question, a last question? Well, I contradict myself, but before I try to wrap it up in a nutshell, I would like to take the opportunity, because there are certain set points for breaking up this conference. We talked not only about losses and difficulties, but what you, Ms. Geipel, just stated. You have the feeling that the space of criticism is overcrowded. Well, this somehow reverberated in me. Can you elaborate on this? Because we've got to deal with, even if we summarize the various panels with the breaking up of speaker positions, loss of common ground was mentioned repeatedly, loss of perspective, and that's exactly for you, that sway back and forth between fiction, historiography, and reporting on the status of society. Could you elaborate on that? Yes. Well, I use the term overrun. That sounds very sharp. Well, we have now an exacerbation in the social relations and criticism. Verena, Lueken mentioned it too. Criticism needs the counterpart as a subject, a topic. My feeling is that our current societal condition makes it more and more difficult to put oneself in a position facing a well-defined subject. Well, I do not need to conjure up the permanent crises. What criticism right in the midst of a catastrophe? That would be my question. Well, I don't know. Somehow, well, a bit, I have a bad gut feeling when it comes to the current condition. Probably this is also the triggering moment for this research group. We have the feeling something has broken down, has imploded, something that must not break down because it debilitates our breathing space. We are hunkering behind a certain condition before having developed the tools needed to analyze this situation. Well, this is certainly not a very entertaining or edifying image. I think, well, it has, film criticism has something of immersive. It's also a distancing moment. Just because I can select frame and I have to shed light on certain things, writing reviews is probably one escape route from this feeling of being overrun and to instill courage. Thank you very much for your presentations and the discussion, and I wish you a nice evening.